He was a man who lost everything and stopped believing in saving anyone. She was a woman who had nothing left, except a secret she didn't even understand. When their worlds collide, the past returns, enemies close in, and survival becomes a choice neither of them can escape. But the real question is, who will they become when everything burns? This channel brings you Western stories about cowboys, love, sacrifice, family, and the quiet kindness between people. Lesson of this story: pain can break you, or rebuild you into someone stronger. If you feel the story, like, comment, share, and subscribe to stay with us.
The Montana rain did not fall. It drove itself into the earth like iron nails. It hammered against the steep roof of the Blackwood Community Church, washing the white paint from the clapboards and turning the main street into a churning river of black mud. And it beat mercilessly against Clara Vance's wedding dress. The gown, a masterpiece of ivory Boston silk that had taken her months to embroider by candlelight, was utterly ruined. The heavy fabric clung to her shivering frame, the delicate lace at the hem now soaked in freezing, filth-ridden water. Clara sat on the top step of the church porch, her knees drawn to her chest, the overhang doing little to protect her from the biting wind. In her trembling, blue-tinged fingers she clutched a crumpled yellow telegram. Circumstances changed. Do not wait in Montana. Julian. 9 words. 9 words to erase a 2-year courtship, a grueling month-long journey across the country, and every meager hope she had left. Julian Preston, the charismatic businessman who had promised to save her from the crushing debts her father left behind in Boston, was not coming. The church doors behind her were locked. The Reverend had gone home hours ago, offering hollow apologies and a sympathetic look that tasted like pity. She had 20 cents to her name. She knew no one within 1,000 miles. As the cold seeped past her skin and settled deep into her bones, Clara closed her eyes. She didn't have the energy to cry. She was just so incredibly, overwhelmingly tired. Maybe, she thought numbly, if I just close my eyes, the cold will stop hurting. Down the street, the rhythmic, heavy slosh of hooves breaking through the mud cut through the roar of the storm. Silas Thorne pulled his collar up against the biting wind. His dark eyes narrowed under the dripping brim of his Stetson. He hated town. He hated the noise, the prying eyes, and the suffocating feeling of being around people who knew exactly what a man had lost. But a ranch couldn't run without coffee flour and horseshoe nails, and the storm had forced his hand. He spurred his gelding forward, eager to load his pack horse and retreat to the isolation of his cabin in the foothills. As he passed the church, a flash of stark white in the gloom caught his eye. Silas pulled back on the reins, his horse snorting in protest. It was a woman, or the ghost of one. She was huddled on the church steps, looking like a discarded porcelain doll in a dress that had no business existing in a frontier town like Blackwood. Silas's jaw tightened. 36 years of hard living, a brutal war, and a tragedy that had hollowed out his soul had taught him one absolute truth. Mind your own damn business. Saving people only got you gutted. He had failed to save the 2 people who mattered most to him 6 years ago. He wasn't about to play hero for a stranger. He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward. He would ride past. Someone else would find her. But as he moved, a sudden gust of wind swept across the porch, and the woman let out a small, broken gasp, a ragged sound of pure, helpless terror. Silas's chest seized. His hand tightened on the leather reins until his knuckles turned white. It was just the wind. It was just the storm. But for one agonizing second, it sounded exactly like the whimper his 4-year-old daughter used to make when she woke up from a nightmare. Damn it, Silas cursed silently. Damn it all to hell. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the mud. He tied his horses to the post and marched up the wooden steps, the heavy thud of his spurs announcing his arrival. Clara didn't look up until a massive shadow blocked out the fading afternoon light. She blinked through wet, tangled lashes. The man standing over her was intimidating. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark canvas duster that dripped rainwater onto the planks. His face was weathered and hard, marked by a faded scar that cut across his left cheekbone, disappearing into a day-old stubble. His eyes, a striking, flinty gray, studied her with a mixture of irritation and grim understanding. "Church is closed, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate over the storm. "I know," Clara whispered. Her teeth chattered so violently the words barely formed. I'm just resting." "You're freezing to death." Before she could protest, Silas shrugged off his heavy, fur-lined duster. He stepped forward and draped it roughly over her trembling shoulders. The coat was massive, swallowing her whole, but it radiated a fierce, masculine heat that smelled of leather, pine, and wood smoke. The sudden warmth made Clara let out an involuntary sob. "Where is your family?" Silas asked, his eyes scanning the empty street. "I don't have any." "Husband?" He nodded at the ruined white silk. Clara looked down at the telegram in her hand, her thumb brushing over Julian's name. He didn't come." Silas read the situation in 3 seconds. A runaway bride or a discarded one. A Boston accent. Soft hands. She wouldn't last the night in Blackwood, let alone the winter. He should take her to the boarding house, give the innkeeper $1, and wash his hands of it. But looking down at her pale, aristocratic face, smudged with dirt but remarkably composed despite her despair, something ancient and protective flared to life in his deadened chest. "Can you stand?" he asked. Clara nodded slowly. With clumsy, frozen fingers, she pulled his coat tighter around her and forced herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled, and Silas instinctively caught her by the elbow. His grip was firm, his calloused hand steadying her with an ease that surprised her. "I have a trunk," she mumbled, gesturing vaguely to the side of the porch where a large, brass-bound leather trunk sat in the shadows. "It's all I have left in the world." "I'll get it. Go to the horse." Clara stumbled down the steps toward the massive black gelding. Behind her, Silas crouched and grabbed the leather handles of the trunk. He braced his legs and hoisted it up. Silas froze, his muscles strained against the sudden, shocking weight. For a trunk its size, packed with women's dresses, petticoats, and maybe some books, it should have weighed no more than 60 pounds. This thing weighed easily over 150. It felt like trying to lift a block of solid lead. Silas narrowed his eyes, staring at the brass lock. He had hauled enough gold, iron, and ammunition in the cavalry to know the density of dead weight. "There are no dresses in here," he thought, his instincts sharpening to a razor's edge. "What the hell is this girl dragging across the country?" He looked over at Clara. She was leaning against his horse, looking entirely too fragile to be hauling contraband. She didn't look like a criminal. She looked like a pawn. Silas didn't say a word. He hoisted the unnaturally heavy trunk onto the pack horse, tying it down with swift, brutal knots. Whatever trouble she brought with her, it was already here. He walked over to her, grabbed her by the waist, and lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He swung up behind her, taking the reins. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her voice muffled against the collar of his coat. "My place. It's an hour's ride into the foothills. Hold on." The ride was a blur of freezing rain and impenetrable darkness. Clara leaned back against Silas's solid chest, too exhausted to be terrified that she was riding off into the wilderness with a complete stranger. He rode with a quiet, lethal competence, shielding her from the worst of the wind. When they finally arrived, the cabin was a shadow against the jagged edge of the mountains. It was a sturdy, practical structure of thick timber isolated from the rest of the world. Silas carried her inside, setting her down on a wooden chair before striking a match to light a kerosene lamp. The amber glow revealed a sparse, meticulously clean room. No curtains, no decorations, just survival. He knelt before the stone hearth, tossing in kindling and a heavy log, quickly coaxing a roaring fire to life. The heat hit Clara's face, and for the first time in hours, She felt the agonizing prickle of blood returning to her extremities. Silas stood up, brushing the ash from his hands. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Clara clutched his coat around her, looking up into his scarred, weathered face. Her mind was a whirlwind of grief and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I'm a stranger. You don't know me. Why would you bring me here?" Silas looked at her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the ruined wedding dress. He thought of the unnaturally heavy trunk sitting on his porch, carrying secrets that would undoubtedly bring the devil to his doorstep. He knew he should have left her. He picked up an iron poker, shifting the burning log until the flames roared higher, casting long shadows against the timber walls. He didn't look at her when he finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that left no room for argument. "Because you've got nowhere else to go," Silas said. He turned his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity. "So from now on, you're mine to protect." Clara woke to the sharp, biting scent of pine needles and black coffee. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The mattress beneath her was stuffed with horsehair, firm and unyielding, and the heavy wool blanket piled over her smelled fiercely of the man who had carried her through the storm. Memory rushed back in a bruising wave. The church, the rain, the telegram, the towering cowboy with eyes like chipped flint. Silas Thorne. Clara sat up slowly, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. She was wearing his shirt. Sometime in the hazy, freezing hours of the night, he had handed her a worn flannel shirt and turned his back, telling her to get out of the wet silk before pneumonia took her. The shirt swallowed her completely, the sleeves rolled up 4 times just to free her hands, the hem brushing her knees. She pushed the blanket aside and swung her bare feet onto the cold wooden floorboards. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the hearth and the howling wind outside. Silas was gone. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and moved toward the single frost-rimmed window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stark, brutal, and breathtakingly beautiful world. Beyond the timber corral, where a dozen horses moved like restless shadows, the foothills of the Rockies rose up, crowned in fresh, glittering snow. But it was not the mountains that held her gaze. About 50 yards up the gentle slope behind the cabin, enclosed by a low, meticulously maintained picket fence, stood 2 wooden crosses. Clara pressed her hand to the cold glass. She didn't need to read the names carved into the wood to understand what they meant. The smaller cross, barely coming up to the center of the larger one, told the entire devastating story. He lost them, she thought, a hollow ache blooming in her chest. His wife, his child. Suddenly, his harsh demeanor, his isolation, and the raw, haunted look in his eyes when she had whimpered on the church porch, all made a terrible, perfect sense. He was a man who had buried his heart on that hill, and yet he had still reached into the dark to pull her out. A lesser woman might have crawled back into bed and wept for her own miserable fate. Julian had abandoned her. She was destitute in a wild territory. But Clara was the daughter of a bookbinder who had worked his fingers to the bone until the banks took his shop and his life. She knew how to survive the cold. She knew that tears did not buy bread. "You will not be a burden, Clara Vance," she whispered to the empty room. She turned away from the window and surveyed the cabin. It was masculine and sparse, but there was a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a bin of flour, a jar of salted pork, and a tin of coffee. She tied her hair back with a scrap of ribbon from her ruined dress, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. An hour later, Silas approached the cabin, an axe resting on his broad shoulder, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He had spent the morning chopping wood until his muscles burned, trying to clear his head. He had brought a woman into his house, a city woman. He expected to walk in and find her sobbing, demanding a carriage back to civilization, or completely catatonic from the shock. He kicked his boots against the porch step and pushed the door open. The scent hit him first, not the stale, lonely smell of dust and old leather that usually greeted him, but the rich, warm aroma of baking biscuits and frying pork. Silas stopped in the doorway. Clara was standing by the stove, flipping meat in an iron skillet. She had swept the floor, wiped down the rough-hewn table, and set 2 tin plates with a precision that bordered on militant. In his oversized plaid shirt, her bare legs flashing beneath the hem, she looked ridiculously out of place, yet entirely in command. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his without a flinch. "I hope you don't mind. I found the flour and the lard." Silas slowly leaned his axe against the wall and took off his hat. "I expected you to be asleep, or crying." "Crying doesn't make breakfast, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her tone remarkably steady as she scooped the meat onto the plates. "And considering you saved my life last night, cooking your bacon is the absolute least I can do." Silas walked to the table and sat down, watching her with a narrowed, assessing gaze. She didn't move like a pampered Boston socialite. Her hands were elegant, yes, but when she set the heavy skillet down, he noticed the faint calluses on her fingers, the quick, efficient way she moved. "You're not what I thought you were," Silas murmured, taking a bite of a biscuit. It was hot, flaky, and perfect. Clara sat across from him, wrapping her hands around a tin cup of coffee. "What did you think I was?" "A rich girl playing pioneer. Someone who's never had to work for a meal." A bitter smile touched her lips. "My father was a bookbinder. When he got sick, I ran the presses. I hauled paper, bound leather, and negotiated with creditors who treated me like dirt. Julian—" She swallowed the name like a bitter pill. "Julian promised to pay off the debts. He promised security. I didn't come west for an adventure, Mr. Thorne. I came because I had no other choice." Silas chewed his food in silence. The fierce, quiet dignity in her voice struck a chord deep within him. She wasn't asking for pity. She was merely stating the facts. "Silas," he said abruptly. Clara blinked. "Excuse me? If you're going to cook my bacon, you can call me Silas." A faint, genuine smile broke through the tension in her face, transforming her features and making Silas's chest tighten uncomfortably. "Thank you, Silas." After breakfast, Silas stood up, pulling his coat back on. "I have to check the perimeter fence. The storm might have brought down some timber. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." "I understand." As Silas rode out, Clara felt a renewed sense of determination. She would survive this. She would find a way to earn her keep, maybe find work in Blackwood, and repay Silas for his kindness. First, she needed to put on her own clothes. She walked over to the heavy brass-bound trunk sitting in the corner of the room. Silas had dragged it in last night. It contained everything she owned. 3 practical dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, a few cherished books, and her undergarments. Clara knelt before it, pulling the small brass key from the ribbon around her neck. She fitted it into the lock and turned. It clicked open. She lifted the heavy leather lid. The scent of lavender and old paper wafted up. She reached in, pulling out a woolen shawl and a folded blue cotton day dress. As she lifted the dress, her hand brushed against the bottom of the trunk. It felt strange. The plush velvet lining, which should have rested flat against the wooden base, felt stiff and slightly elevated. Frowning, Clara pressed her palms against the velvet. It yielded slightly, then stopped, giving way to something hard and flat hidden beneath. Her heart gave a strange, erratic flutter. She pushed her fingers against the edge of the velvet lining, searching for a seam. The fabric was tightly glued, but at the corner it had begun to fray. With a sharp tug, Clara ripped the velvet back. She stopped breathing. There was a false bottom made of thin cedar wood. Beneath it lay neat, tightly bound stacks of heavy parchment paper. Trembling, Clara reached down and pulled out one of the bundles. She untied the twine. The ornate, official-looking ink stared back at her. United States Bearer Bonds. The denomination on the top certificate was $1,000. Beneath it was another, and another. There were dozens of stacks. Clara's mind raced, doing the horrifying mathematics. Maybe $60,000, a staggering, unimaginable fortune in 1879, and they were bearer bonds, untraceable. Whoever held the paper owned the money. The room seemed to tilt. The blood roared in Clara's ears. Julian hadn't abandoned her because he changed his mind about marrying her. He had never intended to marry her. He was a smuggler, a thief, or worse. He had used her, a desperate, grieving, completely innocent woman, as a blind mule to transport stolen government bonds across the country, knowing that the law would never suspect a grieving bride mourning her father. He was supposed to meet her here, take the trunk, and disappear. But something had gone wrong. He had been delayed, or the law was closing in on him. So he sent a telegram to keep her waiting at the church, planning to intercept the trunk when the coast was clear. She wasn't a runaway bride. She was a target. Clara dropped the bonds as if they were made of fire. She fell back against the floorboards, pressing her hands over her mouth to muffle the scream building in her throat. She had brought a death sentence into the home of the only man who had shown her kindness. When Silas returned to the cabin an hour later, he knew something was wrong before he even opened the door. The stillness inside was too heavy, like the air right before a lightning strike. He unholstered his Colt revolver, keeping it low against his thigh, and pushed the door open. "Clara?" She was sitting on the floor beside her open trunk. She was fully dressed now in a simple, high-collared blue dress, her hair pinned up, but her face was the color of ash. Scattered across the wooden floorboards around her like fallen leaves were stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds. Silas lowered his gun, his eyes locking onto the paper. He didn't ask what it was. He recognized federal currency when he saw it. He walked slowly into the room, closing and barring the door behind him. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Silas, I swear to God I didn't know." He packed the trunk. "He said he was sending my things ahead. He used me." She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the edge of the table. "I have to leave. If he's looking for this, he'll come here. I've brought this into your home. I have to go right now." She stepped toward the door, but Silas moved faster. He stepped into her path, his massive frame blocking her exit. "Where exactly are you going to go, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. "Out into the snow? With $60,000 in stolen federal paper? You wouldn't make it 5 miles before someone slit your throat." "I don't care about the money. I'll leave it in the snow. But if Julian finds me here, he will kill you." "Let him try." The absolute certainty in Silas's voice stunned her into silence. He didn't look afraid. He didn't look angry at her. He looked like a soldier analyzing a battlefield. Silas knelt down and began gathering the bonds with efficient, sweeping motions. "Your fiancé didn't leave you at the altar because he got cold feet. He used a train line to move stolen money using a desperate woman as cover. He sent that telegram hoping you'd wait like a good, obedient girl until he could quietly collect his prize." "And now I have his prize," Clara said, a bitter sob escaping her. "Silas, you have to let me go." "You've already lost your family. I will not let you lose your life because of my stupidity." Silas stopped gathering the papers. He looked up at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes pinned her to the spot. "You listen to me," he said roughly. "Last night I told you that you were mine to protect. I didn't say, unless it gets complicated. I didn't say unless there's money involved. I don't give a damn about Julian, and I don't give a damn about these bonds. You are not leaving this cabin." He stood up, carrying the stacks of paper. He walked to the center of the room, pulled a hunting knife from his belt, and wedged the blade between 2 floorboards beneath the heavy oak table. With a sharp twist, he pried the board up, revealing a dark, hollow space. He dropped the bonds inside, replaced the board, and kicked the rug over it. "It doesn't exist," Silas said, sheathing his knife. "Now we wait." They didn't have to wait long. 2 hours past noon, the sharp, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves echoed up the trail. Silas grabbed his Winchester rifle from above the mantel, checking the lever action. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the rifle resting casually but lethally in the crook of his arm. It wasn't Julian. It was Gideon, the town's sheriff, a grizzled man with a thick gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much blood in the territory. He pulled his horse to a halt, resting his hands on the pommel of his saddle. "Afternoon, Silas," Gideon called out, his breath pluming. "Gideon, what brings the law all the way up my mountain?" Gideon spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Trouble in town. We got an Easterner arrived on the morning stage. Fancy suit, silver-tipped cane. Talks like he owns the federal government. Name of Julian Preston." Inside the cabin, Clara, pressed against the wall beside the door, clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a gasp. "He's looking for a woman," Gideon continued, his eyes drifting over the cabin. "Says his bride-to-be lost her mind, stole his life savings and fled, offering a handsome reward for her return, and the money." "Is that so?" Silas's face was carved from granite. "And you came all the way up here to tell me?" "I came up here because Tommy at the livery stable mentioned he saw you ride out last night with a woman on the back of your horse." Gideon leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Now, Silas, you and I have an understanding. I know you don't look for trouble, but this Preston fellow, he ain't using the law. He's asking around for hired guns. He's looking for blood. I appreciate the warning, Gideon." The sheriff nodded slowly. "If you got a stray dog up here, Silas, you make sure it don't bite you. And if it brings wolves to your door, you call me." "I handle my own wolves," Silas said flatly. Gideon tipped his hat and turned his horse around, riding back down the trail. Silas walked back inside. Clara was shaking, her eyes wide. "He's here. Julian is here." "I know." Silas walked to the table and began loading extra shells into his pockets. "He's putting a bounty on you so the local scum will do his dirty work. But he's impatient. A man who steals 50 grand doesn't like waiting for amateurs." "What are we going to do?" "We let him make a mistake." The mistake happened just before dusk. The sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple when a single rider approached the cabin. Silas stepped out onto the porch, leaving the door cracked open just enough for Clara to hear. Julian Preston dismounted smoothly. He was exactly as Gideon had described, immaculately dressed in a tailored wool overcoat, a silk cravat at his throat. He looked wealthy, refined, and entirely out of place against the rugged backdrop of the Rockies. But Silas saw the man underneath the suit. He saw the cold reptilian calculation in the man's eyes. "You must be Mr. Thorne," Julian said, his voice smooth, cultured, and dripping with false politeness. "I believe you have something of mine." "I have a lot of things," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble. "You'll have to be specific." Julian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My fiancée, Clara Vance. I was told a large man matching your description took her from the church last night. The poor girl is unwell, prone to hysterics. She took a considerable sum of money from me in her confusion." "She didn't mention any money," Silas lied flawlessly. "She mentioned a coward who left her freezing in the mud." Julian's smile tightened, the mask cracking just a fraction. "Mr. Thorne, let's not play games. I am a reasonable man, and a wealthy one. Bring the girl and her trunk out here, and I will gladly compensate you for your trouble. $500. More money than a dirt farmer like you sees in a decade." Inside, Clara felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. $500 to betray her. It was a fortune to a man living in a cabin. "That's a generous offer," Silas said slowly. Julian pulled a leather ledger from his breast pocket. "I can write the draft right now." Silas moved. He didn't draw the Winchester. Instead, in a blur of motion that belied his size, He reached behind the porch post and brought up a double-barreled shotgun he had leaned there earlier. He leveled the twin, gaping muzzles directly at the center of Julian's tailored chest. The metallic clack-clack of the hammers pulling back echoed like a thunderclap in the quiet valley. Julian froze, the ledger slipping from his fingers to fall into the snow. "Here is my counter-offer," Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "You get back on that rented horse. You ride back to town. You get on the next train heading east. And you forget the name Clara Vance ever existed." Julian stared at the barrels of the shotgun, his handsome face twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. The refined gentleman vanished, leaving behind the ruthless smuggler who would kill anyone who stood in his way. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, cowboy," Julian spat. "That money belongs to people who will burn this mountain to ash to get it back." "Then let them come," Silas said, not moving an inch. "I'll bury them on the hill with the rest of my ghosts. Now. Get off my land." Julian slowly raised his hands, backing toward his horse. He mounted with tight, furious movements. He looked down at Silas, then shifted his gaze to the cracked cabin door, knowing Clara was listening. A cold, vicious smile spread across his face. "You think you can protect her?" Julian sneered. "I was going to be merciful. But now? You just dug your own grave, friend. And hers right next to it." Julian yanked his horse around and galloped down the trail into the gathering dark. Silas lowered the shotgun, his jaw tight. He stood on the porch, watching the shadows swallow the trail, knowing that the war had just begun. He turned and walked back inside, barring the heavy oak door. Clara was standing by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked at the man who had just refused $500 and invited a death sentence onto his own head, just to keep her safe. "He's going to send men," she whispered. "I know," Silas said. He walked over to her, his gray eyes softening just a fraction as he looked down at her pale face. He reached out, his rough, calloused knuckles brushing lightly against her cheek. "Let them come, Clara. Let them come." The night did not bring peace. It brought a suffocating, heavy dread that settled over the cabin like a woolen shroud. Silas did not sleep. He sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, the Winchester rifle resting across his thighs, his eyes tracking the invisible movement of the wind outside the frost-caked window. Every creak of the timber, every sudden rush of air down the chimney, made his muscles coil with lethal anticipation. In his bed across the room, Clara lay awake. She was facing the wall, her breathing deliberately slow and even, but Silas knew she wasn't sleeping. The tension radiating from her small frame was palpable. She was terrified, and she had every right to be. Julian Preston was not the kind of man to rally a drunken mob of townsfolk. He was a creature of calculated cruelty. Because the bonds were stolen, he couldn't involve the federal marshals or the Pinkertons. He had to rely on men who dealt in shadow and blood, bounty hunters, border ruffians, killers who didn't ask questions so long as the gold was heavy enough. And the frontier was crawling with them. When the pale, bruised light of dawn finally broke over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, the oppressive silence outside felt unnatural. Silas stood, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked to the window, peering through a small gap he had rubbed in the frost. The corral was too quiet. "Stay here," Silas said, not looking back as he shrugged on his heavy duster. "Lock the door the second it closes. Do not open it until you hear my voice." Clara sat up, clutching the wool blanket to her chest. Her face was pale, but she nodded. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet padding against the cold floorboards, and slid the heavy iron bolt home the moment Silas stepped onto the porch. Silas moved with a predator's grace, his boots making almost no sound against the freshly fallen snow. He kept his back to the cabin wall, his eyes scanning the tree line. The pine trees stood like dark sentinels, offering 100 places for a sniper to hide. He moved toward the barn. His horses were huddled together in the far corner of the corral, their ears pinned back, their breath puffing in nervous, erratic bursts. They were spooked. Then Silas saw it. Lying in the center of the corral, half covered by the drifting snow, was a horse. It wasn't one of Silas's prime geldings. It was an old sway-backed roan that had wandered up from the valley a week ago, seeking shelter. It was dead. A single clean bullet hole marked its forehead. Silas's jaw tightened into a rigid line. This was not a raid. A raid was loud, fast, and driven by theft. This was a message. It was psychological warfare. The men out there were telling him that they could get close. They could kill what was his, and they could do it without him ever hearing the shot. He walked slowly to the barn doors. Driven deep into the heavy oak wood, pinning a scrap of red cloth to the grain, was a wicked, serrated hunting knife. Silas pulled the knife free. The steel was high quality, the handle wrapped in worn black leather. It was a killer's blade. He recognized the tactic immediately. It was meant to instill a paralyzing paranoia. They wanted him to exhaust himself, to burn through his adrenaline staring at the trees, waiting for an attack that would only come when he was too tired to lift his gun. He walked back to the cabin, his mind working through the tactical reality of their situation. He was one man. He had plenty of ammunition, but he couldn't watch every window, every door, every hour of the day. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The heavy bolt slid back, and Clara pulled the door open. She took one look at his face and the bloody hunting knife in his hand, and the last of her Boston naivety vanished. "They're here," she whispered. "They're in the tree line," Silas confirmed, locking the door behind him and tossing the knife onto the table. It landed with a heavy final thud. "They shot a stray horse in the corral and left that blade on the barn door. They're trying to wear us down." Clara stared at the knife, a cold shiver racing down her spine. Why don't they just attack? Because attacking a fortified cabin costs lives. They want us to panic. They want us to make a mistake to try and run for the town. Silas turned to her, his gray eyes intense. "We are not going to run. But I need to know you can protect yourself if they breach the walls." He walked over to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed, unlocked it, and pulled out a smaller weapon, a beautifully maintained Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolver. He checked the cylinder, ensuring it was empty, and walked back to her. "Hold out your hand," he commanded gently. Clara hesitated, then extended her right hand. Silas placed the heavy, cold steel of the revolver into her palm. Her hand dropped slightly under the unexpected weight. "It's heavy," she murmured, staring at the blued steel. "It is, and it kicks like a mule." Silas stepped behind her, entirely invading her personal space. His broad chest hovered inches from her back, radiating a fierce, protective heat. He reached around her, his large, calloused hands gently covering hers, adjusting her grip on the walnut handle. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to destroy whatever is in front of you," Silas murmured. His deep voice vibrating right beside her ear, Clara's breath caught. The scent of him, pine resin, cold snow, and gun oil, was intoxicating. "Wrap your left hand around the base of the grip. It will steady your aim," he instructed. His hands guided hers, his touch firm but remarkably gentle. "When you fire, don't close your eyes. Look at your target. Look right through them. Aim for the center of the chest. It's the biggest target, and it stops a man fastest." Clara stared down the barrel of the empty gun, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was a bookbinder's daughter. She had spent her life surrounded by poetry and philosophy. Now she was standing in a remote cabin, learning how to kill a man. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can do it, if I can take a life." Silas didn't step away. He lowered his head slightly, his cheek almost brushing her hair. "You won't be taking a life, Clara. You'll be saving your own. These men out there, they don't see you as a person. They see you as an obstacle between them and $60,000. If they come through that door, they will not show you mercy. He stepped back, leaving her holding the weapon. "I am going to do everything in my power to ensure you never have to pull that trigger. But if I go down, you don't hesitate. You shoot, and you keep shooting until the gun clicks empty. Do you understand me?" Clara turned to face him. She saw the absolute sincerity in his eyes, the grim reality of the world he lived in. Slowly she nodded. "I understand." "Good." Silas took the revolver from her, loaded 6 brass cartridges into the cylinder, and set it on the table within her reach. "Keep it close." By mid-afternoon, the sun was hidden behind a thick, bruised blanket of storm clouds. The wind began to howl again, carrying the promise of a brutal blizzard. Silas needed to know exactly what he was up against. He grabbed a brass spyglass from his shelf and told Clara to stay low. He slipped out the back door, using the stacked firewood to shield his movement, and made his way to a rocky outcropping about 50 yards up the slope, near the picket fence that guarded the graves. He lay flat on his stomach against the freezing rock, ignoring the cold seeping through his coat, and brought the spyglass to his eye. He swept the dense line of pine trees to the east, looking for unnatural shapes, the glint of metal, or the smoke of a careless fire. For 20 minutes, he saw nothing but snow and bark. Then, a shadow shifted. About 300 yards away, tucked into a deep ravine that offered natural cover, Silas spotted a small camp. No fire, but there were 4 horses tied to a picket line, 4 men. Professional numbers, a small elite squad meant to move silently and kill efficiently. He focused the glass on the men. 2 were huddled under thick blankets, eating cold rations. Another was cleaning a sharp sniper rifle. Then the 4th man stepped out from behind a massive pine tree. He was tall, wearing a black leather coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He turned his head to speak to the man with the rifle. As he did, the gray afternoon light caught his face. Silas stopped breathing. His heart gave a single violent kick against his ribs, and then the blood in his veins turned to absolute freezing ice. Even from 300 yards away, the jagged white scar was unmistakable. It started just above the man's left eyebrow, tearing violently down across his cheek and ending at the corner of his jaw. Cole Maddox. The spyglass trembled in Silas's rigid grip. 6 years evaporated in a single heartbeat. The smell of the snow vanished, replaced by the phantom stench of burning wood and copper blood. He heard the echo of his wife's scream, the deafening crack of a gunshot, and the sickening silence that had followed. Maddox had been a Confederate raider, then a bounty hunter, and finally a ruthless outlaw who slaughtered homesteaders for a few dollars. Silas had hunted him for 3 years, leaving a trail of dead outlaws in his wake, but Maddox had always slipped away like smoke. Eventually, the sheer weight of Silas's grief had dragged him back to this mountain, forcing him to bury his vengeance alongside his family just so he could survive. And now, Julian Preston, the wealthy, refined smuggler from Boston, had unknowingly hired the one man in the entire territory that Silas Thorne wanted to kill more than anything else on earth. Silas lowered the spyglass. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from a rage so pure, so absolute, it felt like divine retribution. The old ghosts and the new threat had just collided. Cole Maddox had come to Silas's home to kill the woman Silas had sworn to protect. A dark, terrifying smile curved Silas's lips as he looked down at the graves of his wife and daughter. "I found him," Silas whispered to the wind. "I'm going to send him to hell." The blizzard hit an hour before dusk, sweeping down from the mountain peaks with a violent, screaming fury. The wind battered the cabin walls, driving snow through the microscopic cracks in the timber. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The world outside became a swirling, impenetrable void of white. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of amber light and stifling tension. Silas burst through the door, carrying an armful of split logs. He slammed the heavy oak shut, dropping the iron bolt with a definitive clang. He dumped the wood into the bin by the hearth, breathing hard, his broad shoulders covered in a thick layer of snow. Clara hurried over with a dry towel. "You're freezing," she said, her voice laced with worry as she began to brush the snow from his duster. "The storm bought us time," Silas said, stripping off the heavy coat and hanging it on a peg near the fire. "Maddox won't move his men in this visibility. They'd lose their bearings and freeze to death before they found the cabin. We're safe for tonight." Clara paused, the towel gripped tightly in her hands. "Maddox?" Silas walked over to the wash basin. He poured a pitcher of cold water and splashed it over his face, scrubbing his hands through his dark hair. When he turned back to her, the raw, haunted look in his eyes made Clara's breath hitch. "The man Julian hired," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "His name is Cole Maddox. He's a bounty hunter. A killer." Clara stepped closer, sensing the unspoken weight beneath his words. "You know him?" Silas looked away, staring into the dancing flames of the hearth. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind and the crackle of burning pine. "6 years ago," Silas began, his voice rough as if the words were tearing his throat apart. "I was a scout for the cavalry. I was gone for 3 weeks on a mapping expedition. I left my wife, Sarah, and my little girl, Emma, here, in this cabin." Clara felt a physical ache in her chest. She moved closer, standing beside him in the warm glow of the fire. She didn't speak. She only listened. "A gang of border ruffians found the place. They were looking for horses, supplies, whatever they could take. Sarah fought them. She was strong. She had a shotgun." Silas closed his eyes, his jaw flexing. "But there were too many. The man leading them, he had a scar down the left side of his face. Maddox." Clara reached out, her hand trembling as her fingers lightly touched his forearm. His muscles were corded tight, like twisted steel cable. "I came home 2 days later," Silas whispered. "I found them. I buried them on the hill." He opened his eyes and looked down at Clara. The agony in his expression was devastating. It wasn't the look of a hardened, unfeeling cowboy. It was the look of a man who had loved so deeply that the loss had shattered his soul. "I spent 3 years hunting him. I killed every man who rode with him, but Maddox vanished. And then I came back here and I stopped living. I just existed, waiting to die." Silas reached up, his rough fingers gently tracing the line of Clara's jaw. "And then I found you on the church steps. A woman thrown away by the world, freezing in the mud. And for the first time in 6 years, Clara, I felt something other than rage. I felt a reason to draw breath." Tears blurred Clara's vision, hot and overwhelming. She didn't pity him. She was profoundly, fiercely humbled by him. This man, who had suffered the ultimate betrayal of fate, had risked his life to save hers without a second thought. "You aren't dead, Silas," Clara whispered fiercely, stepping into his space, her hands moving up to rest flat against his solid, powerful chest. Beneath her palms, she could feel the heavy, frantic thumping of his heart. "You are the bravest, most alive man I have ever known. Julian looked at me and saw a pawn. You looked at me and saw a person." Silas stared down at her, his gray eyes darkening with a sudden, overwhelming hunger. The oppressive danger outside, the storm, the men waiting to kill them, it all vanished, leaving only the heat of the fire and the woman looking up at him with absolute, unwavering trust. "Clara," he breathed, her name a desperate plea on his lips. "I'm here," she whispered. Silas didn't hesitate anymore. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his body, and brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperate souls. It was heavy, yearning, and filled with years of starved affection. Silas kissed her like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. His mouth was demanding, coaxing her lips apart, tasting the sweet, breathless surrender she offered. Clara tangled her fingers into his dark hair, rising onto her toes to meet his intensity. A fire ignited in her blood, burning away the cold, aristocratic constraints of her Boston upbringing. She kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all her fear, her gratitude, and her sudden, overwhelming love into the embrace. Silas groaned, a deep, guttural sound in the back of his throat. He backed her up, pressing her gently but firmly against the heavy timber wall of the cabin. His hands mapped the curve of her waist, the dip of her spine, anchoring her to him as if he was afraid she would dissolve into the storm. For a few precious minutes, they were the only two people in the world. There was no past, no stolen bonds, no killers waiting in the snow. There was only the heat of their bodies, the frantic beat of their hearts, and the intoxicating taste of each other. Silas pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. They were both breathing heavily, their eyes locked in the dim firelight. "I'm not going to let him touch you," Silas whispered fiercely, his thumb brushing over her swollen lips. "I failed 6 years ago. I will not fail again. You are mine, Clara, and I will kill every man on this mountain before I let them take you." "I know," Clara breathed, resting her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring drum of his heart. "I trust you." The quiet intimacy settled over them, a fragile, beautiful peace in the center of the storm. Silas closed his eyes, holding her tightly, finally feeling the jagged edges of his soul begin to stitch back together. Crack! The sound of shattering glass exploded through the cabin. Before Clara could even register the noise, Silas moved with terrifying speed. He tackled her to the floor, his heavy body covering hers just as the sound of the rifle shot finally reached their ears over the howling wind. Thud! A heavy lead bullet buried itself deep into the timber wall, exactly where Silas's head had been a fraction of a second before. Wood splinters rained down on them. "Get down!" Silas roared, rolling off her and snatching the Winchester from the table in one fluid motion. Clara scrambled beneath the heavy oak table, her heart slamming against her ribs in sheer terror. She reached out, her trembling fingers closing around the cold steel of the Smith & Wesson revolver Silas had given her earlier. The wind shrieked through the shattered window, bringing a blast of freezing snow and the bitter metallic scent of gunpowder into the room. Silas crouched beside the window, his eyes narrowed as he peered into the blinding white chaos of the blizzard. Maddox hadn't waited for the storm to pass. He had used the blizzard as cover to move his men right up to the cabin's perimeter. The psychological games were over. The siege had begun. The kerosene lamp shattered into 100 jagged pieces before the echo of Silas's gunshot even faded. He didn't wait for the snipers to aim at the light. He killed it himself, plunging the cabin into absolute suffocating darkness. The only illumination came from the dying embers in the hearth and the pale, ghostly moonlight reflecting off the blizzard outside, bleeding through the shattered window. "Stay low," Silas hissed, his hand pressing firmly against Clara's shoulder, keeping her pinned beneath the heavy oak table. "Do not move. Do not make a sound." Clara nodded, though he couldn't see her. She pulled her knees to her chest, her fingers gripping the cold, checkered walnut handle of the Smith & Wesson. The freezing wind howled through the broken glass, carrying the biting sting of ice and the sharp, sulfuric tang of gunpowder. Silas moved away from her, dissolving into the blackness of the cabin like a phantom. He didn't wear his spurs. His footfalls were entirely silent. He knew every inch of this room, every creaking floorboard, every angle of approach. Outside there were no war cries. There was no barrage of blind firing. That was what terrified Clara the most. If it had been a mob, they would have charged, yelling and shooting wildly. But Cole Maddox's men were professionals. They operated in a lethal, disciplined silence. They were hunters, and they were methodically testing the perimeter of the trap. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the shriek of the blizzard. Clara's teeth began to chatter, the adrenaline in her veins warring with the sub-zero temperatures invading the room. Then she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible crunch of snow against the back wall of the cabin near the kitchen door. From the shadows across the room, Silas's voice barely disturbed the air. "Clara, the spare rifle. Under the bed. Load it." She didn't question him. She crawled on her stomach, feeling her way across the freezing floorboards until her hands brushed the iron frame of Silas's bed. She reached underneath, her fingers closing around the cold steel barrel of a Henry repeating rifle and a heavy canvas box of cartridges. She pulled them back beneath the table. In the dark, operating purely by touch, she slid the brass cartridges into the loading tube. Her hands were shaking violently, but she forced herself to breathe, pushing the brass down until the spring clicked. At the back of the cabin, the heavy iron latch of the kitchen door rattled. Someone was testing it with the tip of a knife, trying to lift the bar from the outside. Silas didn't aim at the door. He knelt beside the wood bin, pressing the barrel of his Winchester against a small, perfectly round knothole in the timber wall that he had specifically popped out years ago for this exact purpose. The latch rattled again. A heavy boot shifted on the porch boards. Silas pulled the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in a strobe of violent yellow light. The bullet tore through the thin wood of the door frame and found its mark. A sharp, wet gasp echoed from outside, followed by the heavy thud of a body collapsing into the snow. "One," Silas muttered softly, working the lever action of his rifle. The hot brass casing clattered to the floor. He moved instantly, knowing the muzzle flash had given away his position. 2 seconds later, return fire shredded the wall where he had just been kneeling. Wood splinters rained down across the kitchen floor. "Silas!" Clara gasped. "I'm fine." His voice came from the opposite corner of the room now. "Slide the Henry across the floor." Clara pushed the loaded rifle across the smooth planks. Silas caught it smoothly in the dark. "Keep your head down, Boston." The siege settled into a grueling, nerve-shredding stalemate. Maddox's men realized that Silas was entrenched and ready. They stopped trying to breach the doors and retreated back into the cover of the tree line. Occasionally, a bullet would smash through the walls or the remaining windows, keeping Silas pinned down, but the assault had stalled. Clara huddled beneath the table, her body aching with cold. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. "Why are they waiting?" she whispered. "They're waiting for us to freeze," Silas replied from the shadows. "Or they're trying to figure out a way to flush us out without getting their heads blown off." An hour passed. The blizzard began to ease, the howling wind dropping to a low, mournful moan. Then Clara smelled it. It wasn't the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder. It was the thick, acrid stench of burning pine and pitch. Suddenly, a dull orange glow blossomed outside the frost-covered windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the ceiling of the cabin. "No," Silas breathed. He crawled to the window and risked a glance over the sill. His face, bathed in the flickering orange light, contorted into a mask of pure agony. Maddox hadn't set fire to the cabin. He had set fire to the barn. The dry timber, packed with winter hay, went up like a powder keg. The flames leaped 30 feet into the night sky, illuminating the entire clearing in a hellish, undeniable light. And then the screaming began. It was a sound Clara would never forget for as long as she lived. The high, desperate, shrieking whinny of the horses trapped inside the corral, blinded by the smoke and terrified by the roaring flames. They were kicking against the heavy timber gates, the wood groaning under their panicked weight. "Silas," Clara said, seeing the absolute devastation in his eyes. Those horses were his livelihood. They were the result of 6 years of grueling, solitary labor. They were the only thing he had left in the world besides the cabin. If he lost them, he lost his future. "I have to let them out," Silas said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a dead man walking. He reached for the heavy iron bolt on the front door. "Silas, don't! It's a trap!" Clara lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "The yard is lit up like day. Maddox is waiting for you to walk out there. He has snipers in the trees. The second you step off this porch, they will kill you." "I cannot let them burn to death, Clara," Silas roared, the agonizing crack in his composure finally showing. He looked toward the barn, his chest heaving. "I can't just sit here and listen to them die." He pulled his arm from her grip and grabbed the handle of the door. Clara's mind raced. Maddox wanted Silas dead, but Julian didn't care about a blood feud. Julian was a greedy, arrogant smuggler who had traveled 2,000 miles for one reason only: the money. Clara scrambled backward, throwing the rug aside. She jammed her fingernails into the seam of the floorboards, tearing the skin, and yanked the loose plank up. She reached into the hollow space and grabbed handfuls of the thick, heavy bearer bonds. She stood up, clutching $60,000 to her chest. "Silas!" she shouted over the roar of the fire. "Open the door! Just a crack!" Silas turned, his eyes widening as he saw the federal paper in her hands. "Clara, what the hell are you doing?" "Taking away their reason to stay." Before Silas could stop her, Clara lunged toward the cracked window. She smashed the remaining jagged shards of glass out with the barrel of her revolver. The freezing wind and the roaring heat of the barn fire rushed in. "Julian!" Clara screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying over the crackling flames. "Julian Preston, is this what you came for?" She shoved the first stack of bearer bonds through the window. She didn't just drop them. She untied the twine and hurled the loose papers into the violent swirling drafts of the blizzard and the fire. The heavy parchment caught the wind. Like a flock of morbid, expensive birds, thousands of dollars took flight across the illuminated yard. Some drifted into the snow, others were sucked directly into the updraft of the burning barn, the edges curling and igniting instantly into ash. "No!" a voice shrieked from the tree line. It was frantic, high-pitched, and entirely unhinged. Julian broke cover. He stumbled out of the pine trees, his tailored overcoat flapping in the wind, his eyes wide with horror as he watched his fortune burning in the air. He dropped to his knees in the snow, frantically trying to catch the fluttering papers, shoving wet, ruined bonds into his pockets. "Get back in the trees, you idiot!" Maddox's furious roar echoed from a different position. But Julian wasn't listening. He was scrambling toward the burning barn, chasing a burning $10,000 certificate. The cohesion of the attackers completely shattered. Maddox's snipers were momentarily distracted by the sight of a fortune raining down from the sky and their employer losing his mind in the middle of a kill zone. "Now!" Clara gasped, throwing the last bundle into the wind. Silas didn't hesitate. The tactical advantage had shifted. He rested the Winchester on the windowsill. He didn't aim at Julian. The man was a pathetic distraction. He aimed at the muzzle flash that had flared when Maddox yelled. He fired twice. A heavy body tumbled out of the branches of a large pine tree and crashed into the snow. 2 down, Maddox and 1 sniper left. "Retreat!" Maddox bellowed from the shadows. He realized the element of control was gone. The yard was too bright, his men were exposed, and Julian was a liability. "Grab the idiot and fall back!" The remaining sniper broke cover, grabbing Julian by the collar of his coat and dragging him, kicking and screaming about his money, back into the darkness of the trees. Silas fired once more to keep their heads down, but the shadows swallowed them. Outside, the heavy timber gate of the corral finally gave way under the weight of the panicked horses. With a sound like a thunderclap, the wood splintered, and the herd surged forward, galloping wildly past the burning barn and disappearing into the snowy expanse of the foothills. They were gone. The attackers, the horses, the money. Silas slowly lowered the rifle. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire in the hearth and the distant roar of the burning barn. He turned to Clara. She was sitting on the floor, her hands empty, her blue dress stained with soot and blood from her torn fingernails. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, waiting for him to be angry that she had just thrown away a fortune. Instead, Silas dropped his rifle. He crossed the room in 3 strides, fell to his knees in front of her, and pulled her into a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her hair, his massive shoulders trembling. "You burned it," he whispered. a sound of sheer absolute disbelief and awe. "You burned a fortune." Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his chest, inhaling the scent of smoke and life. "It wasn't a fortune, Silas," she breathed, her tears finally falling. "It was an anchor, and I am done being dragged down." Dawn arrived not with sunlight, but with a cold gray wash of ash and lingering smoke. The blizzard had finally spent its fury. The barn was nothing but a blackened, smoldering foundation, a dark scar against the pristine, snow-covered valley. The corral was empty, the tracks of Silas's horses leading far up into the high ridges. Clara sat at the table in the cabin, wrapped in Silas's heavy duster, staring blankly at the frost-covered window. She was exhausted down to her marrow, her hands raw and blistered, her face streaked with soot. Yet she was alive. They had survived the night. The sound of approaching horses made her reach for the Smith & Wesson, but Silas gently placed his hand over hers. "It's Gideon," he said quietly, looking through the cracked glass. The sheriff rode into the yard, a deputy flanking him. Gideon surveyed the burning ruins of the barn, the bloodstains in the snow, and the dead sniper lying near the tree line. His weathered face was grim as he dismounted and walked up to the porch. Silas stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him to keep the biting cold away from Clara. "Saw the glow from town last night," Gideon said, his voice heavy. "Storm kept us from riding up. Looks like a war zone, Silas." "It was," Silas replied, his breath pluming. "Julian Preston hired Cole Maddox." Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock. "Maddox? Jesus Christ, Silas, you're telling me the ghost who butchered your family was standing in your front yard?" "He was, and he'll be back." Silas looked out at the tree line. Julian had managed to scramble away with perhaps a third of the bonds, but Maddox wasn't fighting for Julian's money anymore. Maddox had lost 2 men. He had lost his pride. And he knew exactly who was inside that cabin. "Julian is a coward. He'll take what money he salvaged and run," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, calculated register. "But Maddox won't stop. He knows I'm here. He knows I have a woman with me. He'll regroup, patch up his wounds, and come back to finish the job. He'll burn this whole mountain down to get to me. Then we form a posse," Gideon said firmly. "We hunt him down. He'd see a posse coming from 10 miles away. He'd ambush you in the passes and slaughter half the men in town." Silas looked at the sheriff, his gray eyes hardening into chips of ice. "He wants me, Gideon. And I want him. This ends between us. Silas, don't do anything stupid. I know where he's going. Deadwood Canyon. It's the only place in the foothills with enough cover and a warm spring to melt the snow. It's where he hid 6 years ago." Silas turned toward the cabin door. "I need a favor, Gideon." Inside, Clara was trying to scrub the soot from her hands with cold water from the basin. When Silas walked in, the heavy, dark look on his face made her pause. He didn't speak immediately. He walked over to the stove, stirred the coals back to life, and set the coffee pot over the heat. "Gideon is outside," Silas said softly. "He's going to take the bodies. The town is safe." "Did they find Julian?" Clara asked. "No tracks. The wind covered them. But he won't be back." Silas poured a cup of the thick black coffee. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy sigh. From the small leather pouch on the shelf, where he kept his medicinal supplies for the horses, he extracted a pinch of pale powder. Willow bark and laudanum, a heavy sedative. He stirred it into the steaming cup. He walked over to the table and set the mug in front of Clara. "Drink," he urged gently. "You're shivering." Clara took the warm tin cup, wrapping her raw hands around it. She looked up at him, offering a weary, beautiful smile that made Silas's chest physically ache. "We have to rebuild the barn," she murmured, taking a sip. It was bitter, but she was too cold to care. "And we have to track down the horses. It will take time, but we can do it. Together." Silas knelt beside her chair. He reached out, taking her free hand in his thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. "We will," he lied, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll build it bigger, stronger." Clara took another sip. "I never thought I could survive something like this," she whispered. Her eyelids fluttered, a sudden heavy lethargy creeping into her limbs. "But last night, when you held me, I felt so safe, Silas." "You are safe," Silas murmured, leaning forward to press a lingering, desperate kiss to her forehead. "You're safe now, Clara. Just rest." "I'm so tired," she breathed. The cup slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the wooden table. Silas caught her as she slumped forward. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of her one last time. It felt like tearing out his own heart. "I love you," Silas whispered into the quiet room. "And because I love you, I have to leave you." He carried her out to the porch. Gideon was waiting by his wagon, his expression grim. Silas laid Clara gently onto the blankets in the back of the cart, tucking his heavy duster around her to keep her warm. "Keep her in the jail cell," Silas ordered, his voice cracking with the effort of holding himself together. "Lock the door, and do not let her out, no matter what she says or what she threatens. Keep her safe, Gideon. Promise me." "I promise, Silas. But you don't have to do this alone." "Yes, I do." Silas turned his back on the wagon. He didn't look at Clara again. If he did, he knew he would never be able to leave. He saddled his remaining horse, loaded his Winchester, and rode east toward the jagged teeth of Deadwood Canyon, a dead man riding to collect a blood debt. Clara woke to the smell of stale coffee, polished wood, and iron. She blinked, her vision swimming as she tried to force the heavy fog from her brain. The ceiling above her wasn't the rough-hewn timber of Silas's cabin. It was smooth, whitewashed plaster. She was lying on a cot in a small square room. 3 of the walls were brick. The 4th was a wall of heavy iron bars. She was in a jail cell. Clara sat up with a gasp, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "Silas!" she cried out. The door to the outer office opened, and Sheriff Gideon walked in. He looked tired, his hat in his hands. He didn't open the cell door. "Where is he?" Clara demanded, scrambling to the bars. Her mind was racing, piecing together the bitter coffee, the sudden exhaustion, and Silas's melancholic eyes. What did he do? Gideon sighed, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of parchment. He slid it through the iron bars. "He asked me to give this to you when you woke up." Clara snatched the paper, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. It was written in a strong, jagged hand. "Clara, Maddox will never stop as long as I draw breath. If he knows you are with me, he will use you to break me. I promise to protect you. This is the only way I can keep that promise. The cabin is yours. The land is yours. Build a good life, Boston. Do not follow me. Silas." Clara read the words twice. A terrible, agonizing pressure built in her throat. He was going to sacrifice himself to buy her freedom. He was riding into an ambush, expecting to die, believing that it was the only way to balance the ledger of his past and secure her future. Most women would have collapsed to the floor in tears. They would have wept for their tragic doomed cowboy. But Clara Vance had burned a fortune in federal bonds just to shift a tactical advantage. She had survived a blizzard, a siege, and the betrayal of her fiancé. She was no longer a victim. She was Silas Thorne's partner. Clara didn't cry. She carefully folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. She looked down at her side. Silas had left her the Smith & Wesson revolver. It was resting on the cot. She picked it up, checking the cylinder exactly as Silas had taught her. 6 rounds, fully loaded. She walked up to the iron bars, her gray eyes locking onto Gideon with a ferocious, icy determination that made the seasoned sheriff take a step back. "Unlock this door, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice perfectly level, devoid of any panic or hysteria. "Miss Vance, I gave Silas my word. I am to keep you locked in here until it's over." If you keep me locked in here, Silas will die, Clara stated, her grip tightening on the heavy iron bars. He thinks he is a ghost settling a score. He is walking into a trap because he has nothing left to lose. He needs someone to watch his back. He needs a reason to come back. It's suicide, ma'am. Deadwood Canyon is a slaughterhouse. Then we will slaughter them, Clara said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. She leveled her gaze at him. You are the law in this town, Gideon. A man is riding out to face a gang of murderers alone because you wouldn't send a posse. Now, you will unlock this door. You will saddle a horse for me. And we are going after him. Gideon stared at the small, soot-stained woman in the oversized blue dress. He saw the iron will in her eyes, a reflection of the same terrifying resolve he had seen in Silas Thorne for years. A slow, grim smile touched the sheriff's lips. He pulled the heavy brass ring of keys from his belt and slid one into the lock. The iron door swung open with a heavy groan. I'll saddle the horses, Miss Vance, Gideon said, tipping his hat. God help the men standing in your way. Deadwood Canyon earned its name not from the twisted skeletal remains of ancient juniper trees that clung to its steep sandstone walls, but from the absolute, suffocating silence that pooled in its depths. It was a jagged wound in the earth, a narrow gorge of red rock and loose shale where the wind did not howl but whispered. Silas Thorne knew this canyon intimately. 6 years ago, he had tracked Cole Maddox to this very gorge, only to find the ashes of a cold campfire and the mocking silence of a missed opportunity. Today, there would be no missed opportunities. Silas tied his horse a half-mile down the trail, leaving the animal in a concealed grove of scrub oak. He proceeded on foot, carrying only his Winchester rifle, his Colt revolver, and a bandolier of heavy brass cartridges. The snow from the blizzard had not fully penetrated the narrow gorge, leaving the ground a treacherous mix of red mud, frozen puddles, and loose, razor-sharp shale. He climbed. He found a vantage point about 40 feet up the eastern wall, a narrow ledge shadowed by a massive overhang of sandstone. It provided a clear line of sight to the canyon floor, particularly the narrowest choke point, where the trail squeezed between two towering boulders. Silas lay on his stomach against the freezing stone. He checked the action of his rifle. He checked the cylinder of his Colt. Then he settled in to wait. His mind was remarkably clear. There was no fear. There was no desperate hope for survival. He had accepted the reality of this morning the moment he poured the laudanum into Clara's coffee. He was a dead man, trading his remaining hours to purchase a lifetime of peace for the woman he loved. Build a good life, Boston, he thought, closing his eyes for a brief second to memorize the phantom scent of her hair, the exact shade of her storm-gray eyes. Don't look back. 2 hours past noon, the silence of the canyon was broken by the rhythmic hollow clop of iron horseshoes striking stone. Silas opened his eyes, sliding the barrel of the Winchester over the lip of the rock. 3 riders entered the gorge. They were moving cautiously, their rifles drawn and resting across their saddles. The 2 men in front were the surviving grunts from the cabin siege, hard-eyed border ruffians scanning the high ridges. Behind them, riding a massive roan gelding, was Cole Maddox. Even from this height, the jagged white scar bisecting Maddox's face was starkly visible. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat. His eyes narrowed as he studied the tracks in the mud. He was a predator sensing the trap, but his arrogance propelled him forward. He wanted Silas dead just as badly as Silas wanted him. "Hold up!" Maddox's voice echoed against the canyon walls, sharp and grating. He pulled back on his reins. Tracks end. He dismounted here. Silas didn't give them time to coordinate. He sighted the Winchester, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening, a thunderclap trapped in a stone box. The bullet struck the lead rider squarely in the chest. The man was dead before he hit the canyon floor, his horse rearing and screaming in panic. "Ambush! Up on the ridge!" the second grunt yelled, spurring his horse toward the cover of the massive boulders. Silas worked the lever action, tracked the moving target, and fired again. The bullet took the second man in the shoulder, knocking him clean out of the saddle. He hit the ground rolling, scrambling desperately for the rocks, but Silas fired a third time, ending his frantic crawl. Silence fell over the canyon once more, heavy and ringing with the echo of gunfire. Silas kept the rifle sighted, searching the shadows. Maddox was gone. In the 3 seconds it took Silas to dispatch the grunts, the bounty hunter had slipped off his horse and vanished into the labyrinth of red rock and deep crevices below. The real fight had begun. Silas backed away from the ledge. Staying in a fixed sniper position against a man like Maddox was a death sentence. He had to keep moving. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and drew his Colt, moving silently down the steep, treacherous goat path that wound toward the canyon floor. He moved from boulder to boulder, his boots making no sound on the wet stone. Every shadow looked like a man. Every drip of melting snow sounded like a footstep. "You haven't changed, Thorne." Maddox's voice echoed eerily through the gorge. The acoustics of the canyon made it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Still hiding in the high ground. Still thinking you're the hunter." Silas didn't answer. He pressed his back against a slab of cold sandstone, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his revolver. "I remember this place," Maddox taunted, the voice shifting slightly to the left. "I came here right after I visited your cabin 6 years ago. I sat by the fire and thought about your pretty little wife. She fought like a wildcat, you know, begged me to spare the brat. I told her I'd think about it if she put the shotgun down." Maddox laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "She was stupid enough to believe me." A spike of pure, unadulterated rage drove through Silas's heart, but he forced it down. Anger made a man careless. Anger made a man blind. He's trying to draw you out. He wants you to charge. Silas picked up a fist-sized rock and hurled it over the boulder. It clattered noisily against the shale 20 feet away. Instantly, a shot rang out from a fissure directly above Silas's position. The bullet sparked against the stone where the rock had landed. Silas pivoted, stepping out from cover, and fired twice at the puff of white smoke lingering in the fissure. He heard a grunt of pain. He had clipped him. But Maddox was a veteran of 100 gunfights. He didn't retreat. Instead, he dropped vertically from the ledge, landing heavily in the mud, barely 10 feet from Silas. Before Silas could adjust his aim, Maddox fired his heavy Schofield revolver from the hip. The bullet slammed into Silas's left thigh. The impact was like being struck by a runaway train. Silas's leg buckled instantly, the bone shattering. He fell hard into the red mud, dropping his Colt as a blinding white-hot agony flared up his spine. He gasped, rolling onto his back, his hand instinctively reaching for his boot knife. Maddox stood over him, clutching a bleeding graze on his left arm, his breath coming in ragged pants. He kicked Silas's fallen revolver away into the mud. The bounty hunter looked down at the man who had hunted him for years, a dark, victorious sneer twisting his scarred face. He thumbed back the hammer of his Schofield. "You should have stayed dead, Thorne," Maddox spat, leveling the barrel at the center of Silas's chest. "Now I'm going to finish the job. And when I'm done here, I'm going back for the Boston girl. I think I'll keep her around for a while." Silas stared down the barrel of the gun. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg. His hand tightened around the hilt of his boot knife, preparing to throw it in a desperate final act of defiance. "I'm sorry, Clara," he thought. "You charge too much, Mr. Maddox." The refined, distinctly Eastern voice echoed through the canyon, crisp and utterly out of place. Maddox frowned, his head snapping to the right. Standing 30 feet away, emerging from the shadow of the choke point, was Julian Preston. His tailored overcoat was stained with mud and soot, his silk cravat loosened, but his hair was perfectly combed. In his gloved hands he held a sleek, silver-plated derringer, though his other hand gripped a heavy Navy Colt. Julian had followed them. He had let Maddox's men soak up the bullets, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate the last 2 obstacles between him and his fortune. "Preston," Maddox snarled. "Put the gun down, you stupid dandy. I've got this handled." "You have failed spectacularly," Julian replied, his lip curling in disgust. "You lost my money in the snow. You lost your men, and frankly your fee has become an unacceptable burden on my remaining capital." I will put a bullet between your eyes." Julian didn't wait for Maddox to finish the threat. With surprising speed, the Boston smuggler raised the Navy Colt and fired. The bullet struck Maddox squarely in the center of the back. Maddox stiffened, his eyes widening in shock. He let out a wet, gargling gasp as the heavy lead tore through his lung. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees in the mud right beside Silas. Julian smiled, lowering the smoking gun. "Now, Mr. Thorne, I believe you know where the rest of my bonds are hid." Maddox was dying, but he was a creature forged in violence. With the last dregs of his fading life force, the bounty hunter forced his arm up. He didn't aim. He just pulled the trigger of his Schofield. The gun roared. Julian's arrogant smile vanished. He shrieked, staggering backward as Maddox's bullet tore through his abdomen. Julian dropped his silver derringer, clutching his stomach as dark blood instantly stained his expensive wool coat. Panic seized the smuggler. Blinded by sudden, excruciating pain, Julian began fanning the hammer of his Navy Colt, firing wildly, erratically into the canyon. "Die! Die, you frontier trash!" Julian screamed, tears of pain streaming down his face as he emptied the cylinder. Bullets ricocheted off the sandstone, whining through the air. Silas tried to drag himself behind the boulder, his shattered leg dragging uselessly in the mud. He reached for the Winchester slung across his back. Thwack! Silas froze. A sudden, terrifying pressure hit his upper chest, just below his collarbone. It didn't hurt, not at first. It felt like a heavy punch that knocked all the oxygen from his lungs. He looked down. A dark, spreading stain of crimson was blooming across the fabric of his flannel shirt, right over his right lung. The Winchester slipped from his numb fingers. The strength drained from his body with terrifying speed. Silas collapsed onto his back in the red mud, staring up at the narrow strip of gray sky visible between the canyon walls. The gunfire stopped. Julian's panicked shrieks faded into a pathetic, wheezing whimper. Silas lay there listening to the agonizingly slow thump of his own heart. The pain finally arrived, a burning, suffocating fire in his chest. With every breath he took, a wet, bubbling rattle echoed in his throat. He was dying. He knew it. The cold was creeping in from the edges of his fingers and toes, a dark, heavy blanket settling over his mind. I kept my promise, he thought, the edges of his vision blurring into blackness. She's safe. Clara is safe. As Silas Thorne closed his eyes and surrendered to the dark, the distant, frantic sound of approaching hooves echoed down the canyon walls. Clara rode as if the devil himself was snapping at her horse's heels. Sheriff Gideon led the way, his face set in grim, unyielding lines, but Clara kept pace, urging her mare faster over the treacherous, snow-slicked trails leading toward Deadwood Canyon. The oversized coat flapped around her legs, the heavy Smith & Wesson secured in the waistband of her skirt. The echo of a massive firefight had rolled out of the gorge 10 minutes ago. A barrage of rifle fire followed by the heavy booms of revolvers, and finally a chaotic, rapid-fire volley that sounded like pure panic. And then, absolute silence. The silence was 1,000 times worse than the gunfire. It meant the battle was over. It meant someone had won, and someone was dead. "Pull up!" Gideon shouted, raising his hand as they reached the narrow entrance to the canyon. The jagged red rocks rose around them like the walls of a tomb. "We go on foot from here. Keep behind me, Miss Vance, and keep that iron ready." Clara dismounted, her boots hitting the mud. She didn't stay behind him. She walked beside him, her thumb resting on the hammer of the revolver, her gray eyes scanning the shadows. Her heart was beating so fiercely it felt bruised against her ribs. The scent of the canyon hit her first, the sharp, sulphurous smell of burnt black powder mixed with the heavy, metallic stench of fresh blood. They rounded the choke point between two massive boulders and stepped into the slaughterhouse. 2 bodies lay near the entrance, their faces planted in the red mud. Clara didn't recognize them. They moved deeper. 20 yards ahead, Cole Maddox lay dead on his face, a massive exit wound blowing out the front of his buffalo coat. And 10 feet away from Maddox, lying unnaturally still in a pool of dark, expanding crimson, was Silas. "Silas!" Clara screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak tearing from her throat. She dropped her revolver into the mud and bolted toward him, abandoning all caution, abandoning the sheriff. "Miss Vance, wait!" Gideon yelled, drawing his gun. But Clara didn't care. She slid to her knees in the freezing mud beside Silas's massive frame. His face was the color of chalk, his eyes closed. His right leg was bent at a gruesome angle, but it was the wound in his chest that stole the breath from Clara's lungs. Blood was bubbling from a hole just beneath his collarbone, frothing with every shallow, agonizing gasp he took. "No, no, no," Clara sobbed, pressing both of her raw, blistered hands frantically over the wound, trying to staunch the impossible flow of blood. The hot, sticky crimson spilled over her fingers. "Silas, look at me, please!" Silas's eyelashes fluttered. Slowly, painfully, his gray eyes opened. They were unfocused, glassy with the approach of death, but as they landed on her face, a faint, heartbreaking glimmer of recognition sparked within them. "Boston," he breathed. The word was accompanied by a wet rattle in his chest. A thin trickle of blood spilled from the corner of his mouth. "Told you not to follow." "I never listen," Clara wept, pressing her forehead against his, her tears mixing with the blood and grime on his face. "You have to hold on. Gideon is here. We're going to get you a doctor. Just hold on." Silas managed a microscopic shake of his head. He knew. Well, isn't this a touching reunion?" The voice was weak, wheezing, and laced with absolute malice. Clara's head snapped up. 30 feet away, leaning heavily against the sandstone wall, was Julian Preston. He was a ghastly sight. His expensive overcoat was soaked in blood from a gut wound. His face was pale and sweating, his eyes manic and feverish with the frantic, cornered energy of a dying animal. In his left hand, he clutched a fistful of the burnt, ruined bearer bonds he had scavenged from the snow. In his right hand, he held the Navy Colt, pointing it directly at Clara. "Preston! Drop the gun!" Gideon bellowed, stepping forward and leveling his own revolver at the Boston smuggler. "You drop yours, Sheriff," Julian spat, coughing up a spatter of blood. He pressed the barrel of his Colt tighter, aiming straight at Clara's chest. "Or I blow a hole through the lovely bride. I'm a dead man anyway. I have absolutely nothing to lose." Gideon hesitated. At 30 feet, with Julian holding Clara at gunpoint, any sudden movement could trigger a fatal shot. Slowly, agonizingly, Gideon lowered his weapon. Julian let out a wet, triumphant laugh. He looked at Clara, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You," Julian wheezed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You ruined everything. You burned my money. You brought this cowboy into it. You were supposed to be a stupid, obedient little mule, and now, look what you've done to me." Clara stared at the man she had once agreed to marry. The man who had caused all of this death, all of this pain. She looked down at Silas, whose blood was literally covering her hands, whose life was ticking away by the second because of Julian's greed. The terror that had gripped Clara for the past 3 days suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. Keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to destroy whatever is in front of you. Clara slowly withdrew her hands from Silas's chest. She didn't stand up. She remained kneeling in the mud. "You're right, Julian," Clara said, her voice eerily calm, carrying perfectly across the silent canyon. "I ruined everything." Without looking away from Julian's eyes, Clara's right hand dropped to the mud beside her knee. Her fingers closed around the cold, mud-slicked, checkered walnut handle of the Smith & Wesson she had dropped moments earlier. "Any last words, my dear?" Julian sneered, thumbing back the hammer of his Navy Colt. "Look right through them. Aim for the center of the chest." Clara brought the heavy revolver up in one blindingly fast, fluid motion. She wrapped her left hand around the base of the grip to steady the heavy steel. She didn't close her eyes. She stared straight through the man who had destroyed her life. She pulled the trigger. The heavy point .44 caliber revolver roared. bucking violently in her hands. The bullet struck Julian Preston precisely in the center of his chest, shattering his breastbone and tearing through his heart. Julian's eyes widened in sheer absolute shock. He didn't even have time to pull his own trigger. The Navy Colt slipped from his fingers, hitting the mud. He stood frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at the small, soot-stained woman who had just executed him. Then his knees buckled. He collapsed forward into the red mud, the fistful of burnt bearer bonds scattering around his lifeless body like dead leaves. The echo of the gunshot rolled down the canyon walls and faded into silence. Clara let the revolver slip from her hands. It hit the ground with a dull thud. She didn't look at Julian's body. She turned immediately back to Silas. "It's over," Clara choked out, pressing her hands frantically over his chest wound once more. "Silas, it's over. He's dead. They're all dead. You kept your promise." Sheriff Gideon walked slowly toward them, keeping his gun trained on Julian's body until he kicked the Navy Colt away and checked for a pulse. Finding none, the sheriff holstered his weapon and removed his hat, walking over to where Clara knelt in the mud. Gideon looked down at the massive, scarred cowboy. He saw the frothy, bubbling blood. He saw the gray pallor of Silas's skin, the complete lack of tension in his jaw. Gideon was a man of the frontier. He knew death when he saw it. "Miss Vance," Gideon said softly, placing a heavy, sympathetic hand on Clara's trembling shoulder. "Clara, let him go." "No!" Clara screamed, her voice breaking. She pressed harder against Silas's chest as if she could physically force the life back into his veins. "We have to bandage it. We have to get him on a horse." "Clara." The whisper was so faint it was barely a breath, but it stopped Clara's frantic movements instantly. Silas was looking up at her. The fierce, terrifying intensity that usually burned in his gray eyes was gone. It was replaced by a profound, heartbreaking peace. The pain seemed to have washed away, leaving him calm. He moved his left hand, his heavy, blood-stained fingers weakly grasping her wrist. He gently but firmly pulled her hand away from the fatal wound on his chest. "Don't," Silas whispered, a bloody smile touching the corners of his lips. "Don't fight it, Boston." "I can't lose you," Clara sobbed, leaning down until her forehead rested against his chest right above his slowing, struggling heart. "You promised to protect me. You can't leave me alone." Silas shifted his hand, his rough knuckles brushing weakly against her tear-streaked cheek. He looked past her toward the gray, overcast sky of Montana, seeing something only he could see. "You're not alone," Silas murmured, his voice fading into the wind. "You've got the mountain. You've got the cabin." His eyes drifted back to her face, memorizing her features one last time. The ghost of the man he used to be, the grieving, angry widower, was completely gone. He had found his redemption in the snow. He had balanced the ledger. "I told you," Silas breathed, his thumb pausing on her cheekbone. "You're safe now." Silas Thorne exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The faint rise and fall of his chest stopped. His hand went limp, falling away from her face to rest in the red mud. His gray eyes stared up at the sky, unseeing, finally and forever at peace. Clara knelt in the dirt of Deadwood Canyon, the blood of the man she loved staining her hands, and let out a scream of absolute shattering grief that echoed against the ancient stone walls until her voice gave out entirely. The Montana sky cleared the next morning with a cruel, indifferent brilliance. It was a blinding, crystalline blue that stretched endlessly over the jagged peaks of the Rockies, making a terrible mockery of the grief that had shattered the valley below. The storm was gone. The world had simply moved on. Sheriff Gideon had offered to fetch the undertaker from Blackwood, to have a proper wooden coffin built, to organize a service at the church where Clara had first been abandoned. Clara had refused. "He hated the town," she had said, her voice a hollow, raspy whisper stripped of all its Boston refinement. "He hated the pitying eyes. He belongs here on his own land." She washed the blood from Silas's face herself. She heated the water on the cast-iron stove, using a clean linen cloth to carefully wipe away the mud, the gunpowder, and the violent evidence of his final battle. In death, the deep, agonizing lines of grief that had constantly furrowed his brow were entirely gone. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had laid down a burden he had been carrying for 6 agonizing years. When it was time, Gideon did not dig the grave alone. Clara took the second spade. She drove the iron shovel into the frozen, unyielding earth of the hill behind the cabin, working alongside the grizzled sheriff. She dug until the blisters on her hands popped and bled, until her shoulders screamed in agony, channeling every ounce of her shattered heart into the soil. They laid him to rest right beside Sarah and Emma. Clara stood before the freshly turned earth as Gideon nailed together a simple, heavy timber cross and drove it into the ground at the head of the grave. She didn't weep. The tears had run dry somewhere in the echoing depths of Deadwood Canyon. Instead, a profound, heavy silence settled into her bones, a quiet, enduring strength, forged in the fires of a tragedy she had never asked for, but had survived nonetheless. A year is a strange, merciless measure of time. It has the power to turn roaring fires into cold ash, to cover bloody battlefields with wildflowers, and to turn a terrified city girl into a woman of the frontier. The harsh Montana winter eventually surrendered to a brilliant emerald spring. The snow melted, swelling the creeks and turning the valley into a lush sea of sweetgrass. Clara Vance did not return to Boston. When the bank in the East sent a letter inquiring about the whereabouts of Julian Preston, Clara had burned it in the hearth. Julian's body had been dumped in an unmarked potter's field at the edge of the territory line, his name already fading into the dust of forgotten outlaws. The thousands of dollars in bearer bonds had been reduced to nothing but charred flakes of paper scattered in the wind, a fortune traded for a life, and she did not regret a single cent of it. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon in late October, exactly 1 year after the blizzard that had changed her life, Clara stood on the crest of the hill behind the cabin. She wore a simple, high-collared black wool dress, the hem dusted with dry dirt. Her dark hair was braided and pinned securely back, revealing a face that the harsh mountain sun and bitter winds had kissed with a faint golden tan. Her hands, resting lightly clasped in front of her, were no longer the soft, unblemished hands of a bookbinder's daughter. They were calloused, strong, and capable. She looked down at the 3 wooden crosses enclosed by the freshly painted white picket fence. The largest cross in the center belonged to Silas. "The new barn is finished," Clara said, her voice carrying smoothly on the cool autumn breeze. She spoke to the grave not with the trembling sorrow of a grieving widow, but with the steady conversational tone of a partner giving a report. "Gideon sent 3 of his nephews up to help raise the timber. We made it 10 feet wider than the old one, just like you would have wanted, and the herd is back." A faint, fond smile touched the corners of her mouth. That stubborn roan gelding led 6 of the mares back down from the high ridges before the first frost. We had 2 foals in the spring, strong, beautiful creatures. Down in the town of Blackwood, the locals had come to know her not as the abandoned bride, but as the Widow Thorne. There was no marriage certificate filed in the county courthouse. There was no gold band on her left hand, but Clara ran the horse ranch with an iron will, negotiating with buyers, mending fences, and commanding a presence that demanded absolute respect. No man in the territory dared to challenge her claim to the land, and certainly no man dared to court her. The look in her storm-gray eyes warned them that her heart was a locked fortress, the key buried deep in the earth on this very hill. She knelt in the dry grass, her gloved fingers gently brushing a fallen pine needle from the base of Silas's cross. "Sometimes I think I hear your spurs on the porch," Clara whispered, the stoic mask slipping just a fraction, revealing the deep, enduring ache beneath. "I catch the scent of pine and wood smoke, and for a second, I forget. I turn around, expecting you to be standing there in that ridiculous, oversized coat. She traced the rough-hewn letters carved into the wood. Silas Thorne. But I don't cry anymore, Silas. I promised you I wouldn't let this mountain break me, and I haven't. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her black skirt. She looked out over the valley, watching the late afternoon sun bleed across the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the clouds in violent, beautiful strokes of gold violet and blood red. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, but it was hers. The enemies were dead. The past was buried. There were no more ghosts hunting her in the dark. Silas had taken a broken, terrified girl who had nothing left to live for, and he had given her an entire kingdom of pine trees, wild horses, and open skies. He had paid for it with his final breath, and she would spend the rest of her life ensuring his sacrifice was never, ever wasted. Clara turned away from the graves, walking with a steady, measured stride down the hill toward the cabin. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. The horses nickered softly from the newly built corral, their coats gleaming in the fading light. It was a picture of perfect, hard-won peace. She reached the wooden steps of the porch and stopped. Her hand reached out, her calloused palm resting flat against the heavy, load-bearing timber post that Silas had stripped and set into the ground with his own 2 hands. The wood was cold, solid, and immovable. It felt like him. Clara leaned her forehead against the rough timber. She closed her eyes, letting the cool mountain wind rush past her, carrying the scent of incoming snow and the phantom memory of a deep, gravelly voice making a vow in the dark. "You're mine, to protect." A single tear, the first she had shed in months, slipped free, tracing a hot path down her cheek to soak into the collar of her black dress. She patted the timber post twice, a gentle, lingering touch. "I'm safe now, Silas," Clara whispered into the wind, her voice fierce and completely unbroken. "I'm safe. She opened the heavy oak door, stepped inside the warm, fire-lit cabin, and closed it firmly behind her, sliding the iron bolt home against the coming night. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.